He was cleaning up after renovations and thought it was just another day at work. But under the bricks, he found an old briefcase that someone had hidden decades ago. Subscribe to the channel, watch other stories, and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The morning heat was already rising from the cracked asphalt when Leon Harper parked his old pickup in front of the house. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of silence that only comes from places half forgotten by time-faded lawns, leaning fences, mailboxes with peeling paint. The house he'd been working on stood at the end of a narrow street, a two-story relic with weather-beaten siding and tired windows that seemed to squint under the weight of the years. For the past 3 weeks, Leon had been restoring its dignity-patching walls, sanding down floors, repairing what others had long given up on. Today was supposed to be his last day here, the day he cleaned up the rubble, swept the dust, and locked the gate behind him. He climbed out of the truck, stretching his back. The familiar ache of muscles and old bones greeted him, a pain he no longer cursed. It was a reminder that he was still doing what he knew best, building, fixing, making things whole again. He glanced at his reflection in the truck's window, a man of 52, his skin darkened by years under the sun, lines drawn deep around his eyes, his beard touched with gray. He looked like a man who had worked too much and spoken too little, the kind of man who carried his silence like a second tool belt. Inside the house, the air was thick with the smell of plaster and varnish. Sunlight poured through the front windows, cutting bright rectangles across the floor. Leon checked the last of his repairs, a section of molding, the hinges on the back door, and then stepped out into the yard. The client had already paid him and left town, saying only, "Just make it look decent, Harper. Nothing fancy." Leon smiled at the memory. Nothing fancy had been his specialty all his life. The backyard was a mess. Bricks, broken tiles, splinters of wood, and hardened clumps of cement littered the ground. The remains of someone else's mistakes, now his to clean up. He tied a rag around his neck, rolled up his sleeves, and began to work. The sun beat down, the sweat dripped into his collar, and every movement sent small clouds of dust into the air. He moved steadily, methodically, as he always did, driven by habit more than thought. There was something almost peaceful about it, the rhythm of the shovel, the scrape of metal against stone, the sound of his boots shifting through the rubble. He paused once to wipe his brow and looked around. The street was empty, the houses quiet. Somewhere, far off, a lawnmower droned, but here there was nothing but the whisper of wind through dry grass. He could hear his own breathing, steady and slow. For a moment, he thought of his son, Evan, now grown, living states away, with a family Leon barely knew. It had been years since they had spoken more than a few words at a time. He didn't blame the boy. Life had taken them in different directions, and Leon had never been good at keeping close what mattered most. He went back to work. The pile of broken bricks grew smaller as the afternoon stretched on. Each shovelful revealed more of the old ground beneath, layers of dirt and fragments of what once had been the house's foundation. It was routine work, something he could do without thinking, until his shovel struck something that didn't sound right. The noise was sharper, denser, not the dull thud of stone, but a hollow metallic knock. Leon frowned and jabbed the shovel again. The sound came again, unmistakable. He crouched, brushing aside the top layer of dirt with his gloved hands. Beneath a flat piece of cracked tile, he saw something brown smooth and oddly shaped against the gray rubble. He reached down, pulled at it, and felt resistance. It wasn't wood. The surface gave slightly under his fingers, and when he wiped it clean with a rag, a faint gleam of aged leather appeared. A bag? No, it was too rigid, too structured. He dug around it carefully, loosening the dirt, until the object came free. It was a leather briefcase, dark brown, cracked along the edges, the handle stiff and worn. The brass latches were dulled to green, and the corners were chipped. It looked as though it had been buried for decades. Leon turned it over in his hands. It was heavier than he expected. The smell of damp leather and dust rose from it, mingling with the scent of soil. For a moment, he just stood there, staring. Things like this didn't just happen, not in real life. A briefcase hidden under rubble? It was the kind of thing that made men curious and cautious in equal measure. He looked around again, half expecting someone to be watching. The street was still empty. The sound of cicadas hummed from the trees, steady and indifferent. He carried the briefcase to the porch and set it down on a bench. The brass locks were corroded, one nearly broken. Using the edge of his screwdriver, he pried it open with a soft metallic click. A breath of stale air escaped from inside. The contents were layered in dust, as if time itself had settled in to guard them. Papers, yellowed and curling at the edges, were stacked neatly. Beneath them lay an old photograph, sepia-toned, faded almost to ghostly outlines. A woman and a small boy stood in front of what looked like this very house, only new, bright, alive. Behind them, a porch railing gleamed white, and vines crept up the columns. The boy smiled, holding something, a toy airplane, while the woman's eyes, soft and strong, looked straight into the camera. Leon felt a flicker of something inside him, a quiet unease. He turned the photo over, and on the back, written in elegant cursive, were the words, H.M. and R.M., 1942. He looked back at the contents of the briefcase. There was a metal case, small and rectangular, tucked beneath the papers. The initials H.M. were engraved on it. The case was locked, and no key was in sight. He sat back, the heat pressing down on him, the silence of the yard thickening. The rational part of him said to stop, to close it, to turn it in, maybe to the client or the police. But another part, deeper and quieter, told him this was something else. This was a message from the past, something left behind deliberately. He stood and carried the briefcase to his truck, setting it carefully on the passenger seat. The leather creaked as it settled. He looked once more at the house, its windows catching the fading light. There was something eerie in how familiar it seemed now, as if the photograph he had just seen and the real house had overlapped in his mind. The same porch, the same angles. Only time had stripped away the life that once filled them. As he started the engine, dust rose from the tires, swirling in the evening air. The sky was bleeding orange and gold, the kind of sunset that made even forgotten places look almost holy. Leon watched the house shrink in his rearview mirror. He didn't know why, but it felt as though he were driving away from something more than a job site. The briefcase rested beside him, silent, patient, as if waiting for him to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. He told himself he'd just take it home, clean it up, maybe find a clue about the owner. But even as he drove, he knew the truth. He couldn't leave it behind, not after touching it, not after seeing that photograph. By the time he reached his house on the edge of town, the streetlights were flickering on. His home was modest, a one-story structure that leaned slightly to one side, its porch sagging but sturdy. He parked in the gravel drive and sat for a long while before taking the briefcase inside. The air smelled faintly of sawdust and oil. His workbench stood by the window, surrounded by tools, paint cans, and an old radio that hadn't worked in years. He set the briefcase on the table and stared at it under the dim bulb overhead. He could feel something pressing behind his ribs, curiosity. Yes, but also an ache he couldn't name, the kind that comes when you realize you've stumbled onto something that doesn't belong to you, but somehow still feels meant for you to find. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat down, and placed his rough hands on the cracked leather. He traced the initials on the metal case again. H.M. Whoever that was, their story had been buried here long before his time. Maybe it was chance that his shovel had hit it. Or maybe, he thought, things like this don't happen by chance at all. Outside, the night deepened. A dog barked somewhere far off, and the hum of the highway carried through the trees. Leon leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the briefcase. The day had begun like any other work. Sweat. Dust. The same routine that had defined his life for years. But now something had shifted. Something small, but enough to disturb the still water of his existence. He thought about leaving the briefcase unopened until morning, but he knew he wouldn't. Curiosity was stronger than caution, and perhaps, he thought, a man who spends his life uncovering what lies beneath walls and floors eventually forgets how to leave something buried. The light flickered once, then steadied. Leon reached for the briefcase again, his fingers brushing against the photograph. The faces seemed to look back at him, unblinking, unchanged by all that had passed. He wondered who they were, what had happened to them, and why this fragment of their lives had waited so long to be found. He closed the lid gently, set the briefcase beside his chair, and stared into the darkened window where his reflection met his gaze. The face looking back was older, lonelier, but for the first time in years, there was a trace of something else behind the eyes, a glimmer of purpose, faint but real. The night outside was quiet again. The air smelled faintly of rain, and a single drop hit the window pane. Leon didn't move. The house around him creaked softly, as though settling after a long day. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would find out more, about the initials, about the woman and the child, about why this forgotten briefcase had found its way into his hands. He turned off the light, leaving the briefcase in the faint glow from the porch. The house fell silent, but in that silence, something new had begun. A slow turning of fate beneath the dust and the years. And as Leon drifted into sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house he'd repaired had given him something in return. Something buried not in stone, but in memory. The briefcase sat on the table all night, half in shadow, half in the circle of light cast by the small lamp in Leon's kitchen. He hadn't meant to fall asleep in the chair, but exhaustion had claimed him in the early hours. His head bowed, one hand still resting near the leather handle. When he woke, the room was pale with morning light, the smell of cold coffee filling the air. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was or why the sight of that briefcase filled him with quiet unease. Then the memory of the previous day settled back over him, heavy as the dust that had clung to his clothes. He straightened slowly, joints cracking in protest, and poured himself a fresh cup of coffee. The world outside the small window was still. The neighborhood was waking, but from where he sat, it felt distant. He had no plans for the day. No new job until next week. So the quiet hours ahead stretched wide and unhurried. He set his mug beside the briefcase and opened it once more. The papers inside were still damp at the edges, faintly stained from decades underground. He spread them out carefully across the table, each sheet trembling under the weak breath of the fan. Most of the documents were ordinary things: old receipts, insurance forms, what appeared to be war bond certificates, their corners brittle and darkened with age. Some of the ink had faded beyond reading, but other parts were clear, the handwriting precise and elegant. One envelope caught his attention, a thin, yellowing letter addressed simply to "My dear Richard." The script was graceful, written with care, as if each word mattered. He unfolded the page slowly, the paper whispering under his touch. The letter began softly, almost timidly, and as he read, the room seemed to fade. "If you are reading this," it said, "then I have failed to protect what you left behind." The name signed at the bottom, Helen M., brought to mind the initials engraved on the metal case he had found inside. He laid the letter aside and turned to the small leather-bound notebook that had been wedged between the papers. The cover was worn smooth, the corners bent. On the first page, written in faint pencil, were the words, "Personal Notes. H. Martin, 1942. Leon took a breath and began to read. The entries were dated months apart, each one marked by a shift in tone, from quiet hope to fear, and finally resignation. The first pages spoke of her husband, Richard, an engineer, working at a manufacturing plant during the war. Helen wrote about shortages, ration lines, and the sounds of distant sirens that had once seemed like an echo from another world. Her handwriting was neat, measured, but as the pages went on, the lines grew shaky, the letters uneven. She described the day her husband was taken away, accused of hoarding materials that were meant for the government. She wrote that she never saw him again. Leon stopped for a moment, looking at the page in silence. The faint blue veins of ink seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of a woman who had written in the dark, not knowing if anyone would ever read her words. He felt a strange respect for her, this stranger whose grief had been buried beneath the same soil he had walked on so casually the day before. As he read further, he discovered that Richard had hidden something in the house before his arrest bonds, perhaps, or designs for some project he had been working on. Helen wrote that she had promised to keep them safe. "If they take me," the last entry said, "the house will remember. The house will keep it safe." Leon leaned back in his chair. The house, the same house he had been repairing for weeks. It struck him how thin the wall was between the living and the dead. Not ghosts, but echoes, traces of those who had once stood where he stood, worked where he worked, touched the same walls. He rubbed his forehead, his mind full of questions. How many people had come and gone since then? How had no one found the briefcase until now? He glanced again at the small metal box that still refused to open. The initials HM caught the light. He tried the latch once more, but it was rusted tight. After a few minutes of struggle, he gave up, unwilling to break it by force. Whatever was inside could wait. Instead, he turned back to the letters, reading until the sunlight moved across the floor and the air grew heavy with afternoon heat. There were fragments of a life in those papers. Shopping lists, recipes, a postcard from a seaside town, a small pressed flower that crumbled when he touched it. And all of it spoke of care, of the quiet endurance of a woman who had lived through loss and left behind only whispers. It reminded him of the boxes in his own attic, filled with his late wife's belongings, an apron, an old camera, photographs faded to the color of smoke. He had packed them away after her funeral, telling himself that grief was something to be built over, like an old foundation. Now, sitting at his kitchen table with someone else's sorrow spread before him, he realized how foolish that had been. He reached for another letter and found one addressed to Elizabeth. The handwriting was older, the strokes less certain, as though written with trembling hands. The words told of a daughter sent away to relatives during the war, a girl who never came back. "If someday you return," it read, "you will find what your father left us. It is his gift to you, and his promise to me." The letter ended abruptly, the ink smudged by what might have been tears. Leon folded it carefully, his throat tight. He could almost see her sitting at a table like his, the candlelight flickering over her face as she wrote. He could hear the sound of the pen scratching against the paper, the creak of floorboards in the quiet of night. He wondered if she ever saw her daughter again. Somehow he doubted it. That thought stayed with him the rest of the day. When evening came, he closed the briefcase, placed the papers back inside, and sat staring at it in the fading light. He felt the same pull he had felt when he first found it, the sense that it was not finished with him yet. The next morning, he drove to the city library. It had been years since he'd gone inside, and the smell of paper and dust hit him like a wave of memory. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with silver hair tied neatly back, greeted him politely when he asked about property records. He told her the address of the old house and said he was curious about its history. She disappeared into the archives and returned a while later with a thick folder. They spread the papers on the counter together. The house, she told him, had been built in 1938 by Richard and Helen Martin. It had changed hands several times since, finally being sold to the current owner after decades of neglect. There was a note in one file, an obituary for Helen, dated 1970. It said she had died alone, leaving no known family. Leon thanked the librarian, but something about that didn't sit right with him. The letters had mentioned a daughter. Surely there must have been someone left. He went home and spent the rest of the afternoon searching online. Most of what he found was useless, old genealogy sites and broken links. But then, after hours of scrolling, one name caught his eye. Laura Banks, granddaughter of Helen Martin, listed in an interview about local history preservation in another state. The article mentioned her grandmother's wartime journals, lost during a house fire decades ago. Leon stared at the screen, a strange excitement rising in his chest. He hesitated before writing to her. It felt absurd, reaching out to a stranger with a story like this. But he couldn't ignore it. He drafted an email describing what he had found: the briefcase, the initials, the letters, and attached a photograph of the notebook's first page. He ended simply, "If this means something to you, please let me know." Hours passed with no reply. He began to think she wouldn't answer, that maybe he'd made a fool of himself. But late that night, his phone buzzed. Her message was short, almost breathless. "That's my grandmother's handwriting. The briefcase was part of a story she told my mother before she died. We thought it had burned. Can I speak with you?" Leon sat for a long while, staring at the screen. He could almost hear the woman's voice in those words, full of disbelief and longing. He typed back that they could talk in the morning. When he put the phone down, he realized his hands were shaking. The rest of the night, he couldn't sleep. He walked the small rooms of his house, thinking about how the briefcase had waited 70 years to be found, about the line in the diary. The house will remember. Perhaps the house had done exactly that, holding on until someone came who would listen. At dawn, he stepped out onto his porch. The world was gray-blue, still half asleep. He looked toward the horizon and thought of the woman in the photograph, the way she stood beside her child, proud and calm, unaware that her life would soon vanish into history. The same sun that now rose over his yard had once risen over hers. The same air, the same earth, different time. When he went back inside, the briefcase was still on the table, its leather darkened by the light. He knew what he had to do. There was no sense in keeping it hidden, no reason to pretend it belonged to him. The story inside it had already chosen its path, and he was only part of its journey now. He picked up his phone and began to type again, this time to tell Laura Banks that he would bring the briefcase to her himself. He didn't know why he felt so certain, only that some things were meant to be carried by hand, not shipped or sent away in boxes. Some stories, he thought, demanded to be delivered face to face. As the morning grew brighter, he packed the briefcase carefully into a bag, along with the notebook and the photograph. The house felt quiet behind him as he stepped outside, as though watching him go. He locked the door, got into his truck, and sat for a long moment before starting the engine. The road stretched ahead, long and familiar, yet somehow new. The briefcase rested on the seat beside him, and as the truck rolled forward, Leon felt something stirring inside him that he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't hope, exactly, nor was it peace. It was a kind of purpose, an understanding that maybe, after all this time, he had found something that mattered more than work or money or the slow routine of his days. The past had reached out through dust and brick and silence, and it had chosen him to listen. And as he drove out of town, leaving behind the house that had kept its secret for so long, he realized that what he carried with him was not just an old briefcase, but a piece of someone's unfinished life. The road unfolded in a long, quiet ribbon before him, its faded lines swallowed by the shimmer of afternoon heat. Leon drove with the window down, the wind pulling at his sleeves, carrying with it the scent of summer fields and faraway rain. The briefcase lay on the seat beside him, wrapped in a faded towel to protect its fragile leather, though he found himself glancing at it more than the road. It seemed alive somehow, like a companion who had waited years to be taken home. Each mile marker he passed felt less like a distance covered, and more like time unwinding itself, bringing him closer to something he could not name. The world outside blurred into a rhythm of gas stations, cornfields, and stretches of highway, where nothing moved but the shadows of clouds. He thought of the woman he was going to meet. Laura Banks. He had seen only her photograph in that old article, a kind face framed by gray hair, the kind of face that carried the same calm strength he had seen in the photograph of Helen Martin. He wondered if she knew how much this briefcase meant, not just as an heirloom, but as a testament to all the small, unrecorded lives that history forgot. By the time he reached the outskirts of her town, the sky was shifting toward evening. The air was golden, soft, and the trees along the road glowed as though lit from within. He followed the directions she had sent that morning, winding through quiet streets until he came to a house that reminded him of the one he had left behind. Modest, well cared for, with flowers along the path and a wide porch shaded by an oak tree. He parked the truck and sat for a moment, his hands resting on the wheel. The house seemed to breathe in the warm air, waiting. When he finally knocked, the door opened almost immediately. Laura stood there, smaller than he expected, her eyes bright and alert despite her years. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she smiled, a slow, knowing smile that carried the weight of generations. "You must be Mr. Harper," she said. Her voice was steady but tinged with disbelief, as though she were seeing a ghost. Leon nodded and stepped forward, holding the briefcase with both hands. "I think this belongs to your family," he said quietly. The words came out rougher than he intended, his throat dry from the long drive. She led him inside, into a living room filled with books, framed photographs, and the faint scent of cinnamon. Sunlight spilled across the wooden floor, catching on the glass frames of pictures that lined the mantelpiece. He noticed one at once, a young woman and a boy standing in front of a new house, the same image he had found among the papers. Laura saw his gaze and touched the frame gently. "That's them," she said. "My grandmother and her son. My mother never got to meet her brother. He died before the war ended." She turned toward him, her eyes glistening. "You really found it? After all these years?" Leon placed the briefcase on the table and opened it. The leather creaked softly, releasing the faint smell of earth and age. Inside, the papers were still neatly arranged, the photograph resting on top, the notebook beside it. Laura covered her mouth with her hand as she looked. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the diary, tracing the handwriting on the first page. "This is her," she whispered. "This is my grandmother's hand." She sat down slowly, the diary open in her lap. Leon stood nearby, not wanting to intrude, watching as she turned the fragile pages one by one. He could see her lips move silently as she read. The room grew quiet except for the soft sound of paper shifting and the distant creak of the porch in the wind. After a while, Laura looked up. My mother used to tell me about the briefcase, she said. When the house burned, she thought everything was gone. But my grandmother, she always believed it was still somewhere, waiting to be found. She said that what's meant to be remembered will always find its way back. Leon smiled faintly. It seems she was right. Laura closed the diary and set it gently back in the briefcase. You don't know what this means to me, she said. To us. These are pieces of our lives we thought were lost forever. She paused, studying him. How did you find it? He told her about the renovation job, about the pile of rubble and the sound of the shovel hitting metal. He described the moment he had opened it, the photo, the letters, the way he'd felt as though the past had reached up through the dust to stop him. She listened without interrupting, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time, then said softly, Maybe you were meant to find it. Maybe the house chose you. He chuckled, shaking his head. I don't know about that. I just did what I always do, cleaned up after other people's messes. She smiled sadly. Sometimes cleaning up is the holiest thing a person can do. They talked for hours, long after the light faded. She showed him photographs, her mother as a child, her grandparents before the war, a small house that had once stood on the edge of town before it was sold and rebuilt. Every image seemed to carry a weight of longing, as if the faces in them were finally being seen again after decades of darkness. Leon found himself speaking more than he usually did, about his work, about his son, about his wife who had passed away. It surprised him how easy it was to talk in that house, how natural it felt to share the quiet corners of his life with someone who understood the importance of memory. When it was time to leave, Laura insisted he stay the night in the guest room. You've brought me something priceless, she said. The least I can do is give you a warm bed and a proper meal. He tried to refuse, but she wouldn't hear of it. That evening, as he sat at her kitchen table eating homemade stew, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The house felt alive, not with ghosts, but with presence, with gratitude, with the hum of lives finally connected again. After dinner, they sat in the living room, while Laura read aloud a passage from Helen's diary. The entry spoke of her husband's arrest, her fear, and her decision to hide the briefcase where no one could take it. If this house ever falls, she had written, let whoever finds this know that love built it, and love buried it. The words filled the room, and when Laura finished, she wiped a tear from her cheek. Leon sat in silence, staring into the small fire that flickered in the hearth. He thought about all the homes he had worked in, all the walls he had repaired, the floors he had leveled. How many stories had he buried under fresh paint and plaster without ever knowing? Before he went to bed, Laura pressed a small envelope into his hand. Inside was a letter she had written, a note of thanks, and a check folded neatly. He tried to hand it back, but she closed his fingers around it. You gave us our history, she said firmly. Please don't refuse. Her eyes softened. Besides, I think my grandmother would want you to fix your own house next. He smiled at that and nodded, though he had no intention of cashing the check. It was enough to have been part of something that mattered. When he lay down that night, sleep came easily. The old house creaked around him, the floorboards whispering with age, and he dreamed of walls filled with light and voices that had finally found their way home. In the morning, sunlight streamed through the window, painting the room gold. Laura was already awake, making coffee. She handed him a photograph before he left, a copy of the one from the briefcase, newly framed. So you don't forget, she said. Every builder needs a reminder of what lasts. He drove home slowly, the road stretching before him like a memory replaying itself. The photograph rested on the dashboard, catching glints of light with each turn. When he reached his own small house, he noticed how the morning sun fell across the porch, the same way it had the day he found the briefcase. He sat for a moment, listening to the hum of insects in the yard, and then carried the photograph inside. Over the next few weeks, he began to repair his own home piece by piece, the broken railing, the loose boards, the cracked steps. Each repair felt different now, not just work, but a conversation with time. He hung the photograph in his living room, beside a small shelf where the briefcase now sat, empty and polished clean. It had been returned to him by Laura, who said it should stay with the man who had freed it from the earth. "It waited for you once," she had said. "Maybe it should rest with you now." Sometimes in the evenings, he would sit on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun go down, the empty briefcase beside him. The leather still smelled faintly of dust and rain, a reminder of the day he had uncovered something that changed not just a family's history, but his own. He no longer felt the same weight of solitude he once carried. There was peace in his silence now, a sense of having done something right. Months passed, and one day a letter arrived from Laura. Inside was a photograph of a small museum display, Helen Martin's diary, her letters, and the family photograph preserved under glass, labeled "Recovered from the Martin House 2025. Below it was a note in Laura's handwriting. "Your name is mentioned on the plaque. Thank you for bringing our voices back." Leon held the letter for a long time before setting it beside the photograph on his shelf. Outside, the evening light turned the yard into a wash of amber. The wind moved through the trees with a sound like distant whispering, and he thought of Helen's words. "If this house ever falls, let whoever finds this know that love built it, and love buried it." He rose and opened the window. The breeze carried the smell of fresh rain, of earth and memory. The empty briefcase sat quietly in the corner, its worn handle gleaming faintly in the fading light. For the first time in many years, Leon felt entirely at home. The dust had settled, the story had found its end, and somewhere beyond the horizon, he imagined a woman's voice, gentle and grateful, whispering her thanks into the wind. Subscribe to our channel, watch our next and other videos, and share this story with someone who would appreciate it.